The day everything changed started with a constitutional law textbook and ended with me understanding that sometimes justice doesn't come from the system, it comes despite it. I'm Sarah Thompson, and 3 months ago, I was just another 17-year-old trying to survive senior year at Westbridge Preparatory Academy. But unlike most kids at Westbridge, I wasn't born into privilege. My uniform came from the second-hand shop downtown. My lunch was packed in a brown paper bag instead of purchased from the gourmet cafeteria. And every morning, when I walked through those imposing stone gates, I carried the weight of being different. The book in my hands that Tuesday morning was a gift from my grandmother before she passed constitutional law for high schoolers by Justice Patricia McKinley. My grandmother had been a federal judge, one of the few women to break through in her era. She'd given me this book on my 16th birthday with a simple inscription, "Knowledge is power, but only if you have the courage to use it." And let me know in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? We love seeing how far these stories travel. Whether you're here for the action, the heart, or both, thank you for being part of this mission. I used to think I understood what that meant. My father, David Thompson, had been a corporate lawyer at Brennan, Walsh & Associates, one of Connecticut's most prestigious firms. We lived in a colonial house with a circular driveway. I attended Westbridge as a full-pay student, and my biggest worry was whether I'd get into Yale or Harvard. That was before my father discovered his firm was helping a pharmaceutical company hide safety data that was killing people. Before he became a whistleblower. Before everything fell apart. The retaliation was swift and brutal. My father was fired, blacklisted from every major firm in the state. And suddenly, we couldn't afford our mortgage, our car payments, or my $50,000 annual tuition. We lost the house, moved into a one-bedroom apartment above a deli, and my father now works contract paralegal jobs for $20 an hour. But Westbridge offered me something unexpected, a full scholarship. Not out of kindness. Exactly. But because my test scores were perfect, and having a few scholarship students looks good in their promotional materials. I became their token success story. The girl who proved that Westbridge cared about more than just wealthy families. What they didn't advertise was how they'd treat me once I got there. Thompson? The voice cut through my thoughts as I sat in the library during lunch, trying to finish calculus homework. Michael Stevens stood at the end of my table, his perfectly pressed khakis and polo shirt screaming old money. His father was Judge Richard Stevens, who sat on the Connecticut Supreme Court. Michael had inherited his father's sharp jawline and his complete lack of empathy. "It's Sarah," I said without looking up from my equations. "Right, Sarah." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down uninvited. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday." There hadn't been a conversation. There had been Michael cornering me after chemistry class to ask why I thought I deserved to be at Westbridge when actual Westbridge families were on waiting lists. I'd walked away without responding. "We need to talk about your attitude problem," Michael continued, his voice low enough that Ms. Rodriguez, the librarian, couldn't hear from her desk 20 feet away. "You act like you're better than everyone here. But let's be honest about what you are." Christopher Davis materialized beside Michael's chair like a faithful dog. Christopher was shorter than Michael, but built like the lacrosse player he was, with prematurely thinning hair that he tried to hide under expensive styling products. His mother was Westbridge's chief of police, and his father chaired the school board. The Davis family had been Westbridge donors for 4 generations. "What am I?" "Michael," I asked. finally looking up from my homework. The library around us was nearly empty. Most students spent lunch period in the dining hall or on the quad, socializing in ways that required money I didn't have. "Charity," Christopher said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Your charity. A tax write-off, so this place can pretend it's not exactly what it is." I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I'd learned over the past 3 months not to react. Reacting gave them power, and I'd already given up too much power in my life. "My grades speak for themselves," I said evenly. "Your grades?" Michael laughed, but it wasn't pleasant. "You think this is about grades, Thompson? You could have a 4.0 and it wouldn't matter. You don't belong here. You'll never belong here. And every day you pretend otherwise just makes it more obvious to everyone else." I closed my textbook slowly, precisely, the way my grandmother had taught me to do everything with intention and control. "Is there something specific you want? Or are we done here?" Christopher leaned forward, putting his hands flat on the table. "We want you to understand your place. Stop raising your hand in AP government. Stop acting like you know something the rest of us don't. Stop pretending you're one of us." "I've never pretended to be one of you," I said. "Good," Michael said, standing up. "Remember that." They left me sitting alone with my constitutional law textbook and a growing certainty that things were about to get much worse. That afternoon, in AP government, Mrs. Patterson was discussing the 14th Amendment when she asked a question about equal protection under the law. I knew the answer. I'd read 3 different analyses of the relevant Supreme Court cases, but I kept my hands in my lap. Around me, hands shot up from students who'd barely skimmed the reading. "Anyone?" Mrs. Patterson asked, scanning the room. Her eyes found mine. "Sarah, you've been quiet today." 28 pairs of eyes turned toward me. I felt the weight of Michael's warning, the reminder of my place, the subtle but constant pressure to make myself smaller. The Equal Protection Clause requires that state laws provide equal protection to all people within the jurisdiction, I said quietly. But the Supreme Court has established different levels of scrutiny depending on the classification being made. "Excellent," Mrs. Patterson said. "Can you elaborate on those levels?" I could. I could discuss strict scrutiny, intermediate scrutiny, and rational basis review. I could cite Korematsu and Craig v. Boren and a dozen other cases, but as I opened my mouth, I saw Michael Stevens turn in his seat to stare at me, his expression a clear reminder. "I think someone else should answer," I said instead. Mrs. Patterson looked puzzled, but she moved on. Michael turned back around, satisfied. After class, I walked Kyaru to my locker through hallways lined with oil paintings of distinguished alumni, most of whom had attended Westbridge generations ago when it was still a boys' school. The walls themselves seemed to whisper about legacy and belonging, about families whose names were etched into the marble foundation stones. My locker was in the older section of the building, away from the gleaming new wing where seniors with the right last names had their lockers. As I spun my combination lock, I heard footsteps approaching from behind. "You learn fast," Michael said. I didn't turn around. I pulled out my biology textbook and shoved my government notes inside. "That's good," Christopher added. "We weren't sure you were smart enough to get it." "Get what?" I asked, still facing my locker. "Your place," Michael said. "We've been watching you for months, Thompson. Watching you think you can just waltz in here and act like you earned your spot. But we both know the truth, don't we?" I slammed my locker shut and turned around. They were standing closer than I'd expected, close enough that I had to look up to meet their eyes. "What truth is that? That you're here because this place needs a pet poor kid for their brochures," Christopher said. "Not because you belong, not because you're actually smart enough, because you're useful." "And useful things," Michael said, stepping even closer, "need to know their function." I thought about my grandmother's inscription in the constitutional law book. Knowledge is power, but only if you have the courage to use it. But what was the point of knowledge when you were outnumbered and outgunned? What was the point of courage when you were 17 years old and completely alone? "I need to get to class," I said. They let me pass, but I could feel them watching as I walked down the hallway. I could feel them planning that night. I sat in our tiny apartment above Moretti's Deli, trying to focus on homework while my father worked at the kitchen table, reviewing medical records for a personal injury case that would pay him $300 if he was lucky. The apartment smelled like garlic and oregano from the restaurant below, and our neighbor's television was loud enough that I could follow the plot of Jeopardy through the thin walls. "How was school?" my father asked without looking up from his papers. "Fine," I said automatically. He glanced at me over his reading glasses, even working paralegal jobs. My father still dressed professionally every day, pressed shirts, conservative ties, shoes that he polished every Sunday night. It was like armor, a way of maintaining dignity even when everything else had been stripped away. "You know you can talk to me, right?" he said. "About school, about anything." I wanted to tell him about Michael and Christopher, about the way they made me feel small and unwelcome and wrong for existing in their space. But my father had already sacrificed everything to do the right thing. He'd lost his career, his reputation, and his financial security because he'd chosen justice over comfort. I couldn't ask him to fight another battle on my behalf. "I know, Dad, really. Everything's fine." He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He'd been a lawyer long enough to recognize evasion when he heard it. The next morning, I found a note in my locker. "You looked lost yesterday. Maybe you need help finding where you belong." It wasn't signed, but I recognized Michael's handwriting from group projects. I crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. Over the next 2 weeks. The harassment escalated in small but deliberate ways. My textbooks went missing from study hall, only to be found later in the dumpster behind the cafeteria. Someone started a rumor that I was cheating, that my perfect test scores were impossible for someone from my background. My locker was broken into 3 times. Though nothing was ever stolen, the violation itself was the point. I documented everything. My grandmother had taught me that evidence was the foundation of justice. So I kept a detailed log: dates, times, witnesses, photographs of my damaged textbooks. I told myself I was building a case. But really, I was just trying to maintain some sense of control in a situation where I had none. The worst part wasn't the harassment itself. It was the isolation. Other students saw what was happening, but no one intervened. Some looked sympathetic. But sympathy without action is just voyeurism. I learned to eat lunch in empty classrooms, to take routes through the building that avoided Michael and Christopher's usual haunts, to make myself invisible. But invisible wasn't small enough for them. 3 weeks after the library confrontation, I was walking to my car after field hockey practice when I heard voices from the direction of the girls' locker room. The athletic building was supposed to be locked after 6 p.m., but sometimes coaches forgot to secure all the entrances. "Are you sure about this?" The voice was Christopher's, nervous and excited at the same time. She thinks she's so smart, Michael's voice replied. Let's see how smart she feels when everyone sees what scholarship trash really looks like. I stopped walking. Something cold settled in my stomach as I realized they were talking about me. What if we get caught? Christopher asked. By who Coach Martinez left 20 minutes ago. The cleaning crew doesn't come until 8. And even if someone does see us, so what? My dad's a judge. Your dad runs the school board. We'll get a lecture and community service. I pressed myself against the brick wall and listened as they discussed their plan. They were going to hide in the girls' locker room with Christopher's phone. Wait for me to change after tomorrow's practice, and record everything. Then they'd share the video with their friends, post it online, and watch me become the joke I'd always been. She'll probably transfer schools, Michael said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Problem solved. I stood there against the brick wall for a long time after they left, trying to process what I'd heard. They weren't just planning to humiliate me, they were planning to create and distribute what amounted to child pornography. In Connecticut, recording someone without consent, in a place where they had an expectation of privacy, was a felony. Distributing that recording would be another felony. And if I was underage in the video, which I was, the charges would be even more severe. But I was just one scholarship student against 2 boys whose families owned half the state. Who would believe me? Who would care that night? I pulled out my grandmother's constitutional law book and read until my eyes burned. I researched Connecticut privacy laws, federal regulations about sexual harassment in schools, and Title IX requirements for educational institutions. I learned about mandatory reporting, about liability for institutional cover-ups, about the difference between civil and criminal remedies. Knowledge is power, but only if you have the courage to use it. The next afternoon, I dressed for field hockey practice like I always did, but I made some modifications to my routine. I borrowed a small digital recorder from the school's journalism department, claiming I needed it for a history project. I asked Ms. Rodriguez if I could use her office to make some phone calls about college applications, and I sent a carefully worded email to someone I'd met during my internship at the district attorney's office. Then I went to practice and played field hockey like my life depended on it, because, in a way, it did, after practice. I walked toward the girls' locker room slowly, giving Michael and Christopher plenty of time to position themselves wherever they thought they'd be hidden. The locker room was dimly lit, with long rows of metal lockers and wooden benches worn smooth by decades of student use. I could smell the familiar mixture of disinfectant and teenage anxiety that permeated every high school athletic facility. I walked to my usual spot, hung up my field hockey stick, and began taking off my cleats. I was moving deliberately, naturally, giving no sign that I knew they were there, but my heart was hammering against my ribs, and I had to force myself to breathe normally. "Got it," I heard Michael whisper from somewhere near the showers. "Yeah," Christopher whispered back. She has no idea. That's when I stood up, looked directly at the gap between the lockers where Christopher was hiding with his phone, and said clearly, "Connecticut General Statutes Section 53A189, voyeurism, Class D felony, up to 5 years in prison." The silence that followed was absolute. "Christopher Davis and Michael Stevens," I continued, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "You are currently in violation of federal Title IX regulations, Connecticut privacy statutes, and depending on what you've already recorded, potentially federal laws regarding the creation and possession of explicit images of minors." Christopher stumbled out from behind the lockers, his phone still in his hand, his face white with shock. Michael emerged from near the showers, looking confused and angry. "You can't prove anything," Michael said, but his voice cracked on the last word. I reached into my gym bag and pulled out the small digital recorder, holding it up so they could see the red light indicating it was still running. "Connecticut is a one-party consent state for recording conversations," I said. "Which means I only needed my own permission to record everything you just said, including your plan to distribute illegal recordings of a minor." Christopher looked at the phone in his hand like it had suddenly caught fire. "You're bluffing," Michael said. "You're just a scholarship kid. You don't know anything about the law." "Actually," I said, putting the recorder back in my bag and pulling out my phone, "I know quite a lot. I spent last summer interning at the district attorney's office. I've already contacted Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Martinez, whom I worked with on 3 separate cases involving privacy violations. She's expecting my call within the next 10 minutes. Michael's face went through several interesting color changes. "You can't do this. Do you know who my father is?" "Judge Richard Stevens," I said calmly. "Connecticut Supreme Court, which means he'll be especially interested to learn that his son committed multiple felonies while attending a private school that receives federal funding. Schools that are required to report Title IX violations to the Department of Education." "This is insane," Christopher said, his voice rising toward panic. "We didn't even do anything yet. Attempted voyeurism is still a crime, Christopher. And you did record me changing into my practice uniform before you started recording. I could see the phone screen from here. That footage already constitutes a privacy violation." I started walking toward the exit, but I turned back before I reached the door. "You both made a mistake," I said. "You assumed that because I'm here on scholarship. I don't understand how power works. But here's what you didn't realize. Real power isn't about money or connections or family names. Real power is about knowing the rules better than the people trying to break them." I left them standing in that locker room, and I called ADA Martinez from my car before I even started the engine. But as I drove home through the Connecticut suburbs, past houses that used to be like mine, I realized that this was only the beginning. Michael and Christopher wouldn't just disappear quietly. Their families wouldn't let them face consequences without a fight. And I was about to discover that when you challenge people with real power, they don't just try to destroy you, they try to destroy everyone you've ever cared about. What I found in my investigation would change everything, not just for me, but for 6 other girls who thought they were powerless. Stay tuned to find out how one constitutional law textbook became the weapon that brought down the most untouchable families in Connecticut. The phone call to ADA Martinez lasted 12 minutes and changed the trajectory of everything. "Sarah," she said after I'd explained the situation, "this is more serious than you might realize. If they've done this before, and predators usually have patterns, we're not just talking about a couple of teenagers making bad decisions. We're talking about systematic behavior." That word systematic stayed with me as I drove home. It suggested organization, repetition, victims I didn't even know about. Jennifer Martinez had been one of the few prosecutors who'd treated me like a colleague during my internship, rather than just a high school student filling filing cabinets. She specialized in technology crimes and had prosecuted several cases involving digital harassment and privacy violations. "I want you to document everything," she continued. "Every interaction, every threat, every piece of evidence. But Sarah, I also need you to understand something if you move forward with this. They're going to come after you harder than they ever have before. People with power don't give it up quietly." She was right, but she was also too late. By the time I got to school the next morning, It was clear that Michael and Christopher had already begun their counterattack. The first sign was the whispers, conversations that stopped abruptly when I walked past, groups of students who looked at me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to disgust. By third period, I understood why. Someone had created a fake social media account using my name and photos, posting content that made me look unstable, desperate, and potentially dangerous. The posts claimed I was obsessed with Michael and Christopher, that I'd been stalking them, that I'd made false accusations because they'd rejected my advances. It was sophisticated character assassination, designed to destroy my credibility before I could use it. But they'd made a crucial mistake. The fake posts referenced conversations and events that had never happened, included details about my family's financial situation that weren't public knowledge, and used language patterns that didn't match my actual social media history. Someone with access to student records and detailed personal information had created this profile. Someone inside the administration. During lunch, I sat in the empty journalism classroom and started making calls. First, I contacted the social media platform to report the fake account, providing documentation of my actual identity. Then I called Detective Johnson from the Connecticut State Police, someone Jennifer Martinez had suggested as a backup contact if local law enforcement seemed compromised. "Ms. Thompson," Detective Johnson said when I explained the situation, "fake social media profiles used to damage someone's reputation in retaliation for reporting sexual harassment. That's cyber stalking under Connecticut law. It's also potentially witness intimidation if it's designed to prevent you from cooperating with our investigation." "Your investigation?" I asked. "ADA Martinez contacted us this morning. We're opening a formal inquiry into the privacy violations you reported, but based on what you're telling me about this social media campaign, I think we might be looking at something much bigger." That afternoon, I made a decision that would either solve everything or destroy what little standing I had left at Westbridge. I went to see Ms. Carmen Martinez, the school's Title IX coordinator. Ms. Martinez was a small woman in her 50s who had been hired 2 years earlier after the Department of Education had cited Westbridge for Title IX compliance issues. Her office was tucked away in the administrative wing, and most students didn't even know she existed. The school preferred it that way. "Sarah," she said when I knocked on her door, "please, come in. I've been hoping you'd come to see me." Her office was cramped but organized, with legal texts lining the shelves and a framed photo of her law school graduation on her desk. She gestured for me to sit in one of the 2 chairs facing her desk. "You've heard about the fake social media account?" I asked. "I've heard rumors," she said carefully, "but I'd like to hear the facts from you." I told her everything. The locker room incident, the recording, the fake social media campaign, my conversations with ADA Martinez and Detective Johnson. She took notes in a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated she understood the legal implications of what I was describing. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you believe Michael Stevens and Christopher Davis have done this to other students?" The question hung in the air between us. I thought about their confidence, their certainty that they wouldn't face consequences, their casual discussion of their plan as if it were routine. "Yes," I said. "I think they've done this before." She nodded slowly. "So do I. And that's a problem. Because if they have, and the school knew about it or should have known about it, then we're not just talking about individual misconduct. We're talking about institutional liability." Ms. Martinez opened her desk drawer and pulled out a thick file folder. I've been collecting reports for 2 years, she said. Reports that were filed with the principal's office. Reports that were filed with guidance counselors. Reports that somehow never made it to my office despite federal law requiring that they be forwarded to me. She opened the file and spread out a series of incident reports, each one carefully annotated with dates and details. Lisa Chen, sophomore year, reported that someone had taken photos of her changing after swim practice and shared them on social media. Investigation concluded there was insufficient evidence to identify the perpetrator. She moved to another report. Amanda Rodriguez, junior year, found explicit photos of herself posted in a group chat she'd never joined. The photos had been taken through her bedroom window. Investigation concluded it was probably a prank, and no disciplinary action was taken. Report after report. 6 different girls over 2 years, all reporting similar violations of privacy, all having their complaints dismissed or minimized. The pattern was unmistakable. Why wasn't this reported to the Department of Education? I asked. Because, Ms. Martinez said, these reports were never officially filed with my office. They went to Principal Morrison, who conducted what he called informal investigations that concluded there wasn't enough evidence to proceed with formal Title IX proceedings. That's illegal, I said. Yes, it is. It's also a pattern of institutional cover-up that could result in federal sanctions, loss of accreditation, and personal liability for every administrator involved. She leaned forward in her chair. Sarah, I can't compel you to do anything, but if you're willing to let me add your case to a formal Title IX complaint that includes all 7 incidents, we might be able to force a real investigation. What would that mean? It would mean that the Department of Education would conduct a comprehensive review of Westbridge's Title IX compliance. It would mean that local law enforcement would have to take the criminal aspects seriously. And it would mean that every administrator who helped cover this up would be personally exposed to liability. I thought about my grandmother's constitutional law book, about her inscription. Knowledge is power, but only if you have the courage to use it. What do I need to do? Over the next 3 days, Ms. Martinez and I worked together to build a comprehensive case. She contacted the other 6 victims. And, to my amazement, they all agreed to participate. For 2 years, each of them had thought they were alone, that what happened to them was an isolated incident. Learning that they were part of a pattern gave them the courage to speak up. We documented everything, the fake social media profiles that had been created to discredit each victim, the group chat where the intimate images had been shared, which we discovered included not just students, but also recent graduates and even some teachers. The financial records showing payments from multiple student accounts to a single offshore account evidence of a systematic grade manipulation scheme that Michael and Christopher had been operating to fund their harassment activities. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. David Chen, the editor of the school newspaper, had been investigating the grade manipulation scheme for months. He'd discovered that Michael and Christopher weren't just changing grades, they were selling access to tests, selling grade changes to other students, and using the proceeds to fund increasingly elaborate harassment campaigns against students they perceived as threats to their social status. They weren't just bullies, David told me as we sat in the journalism classroom, reviewing his evidence. They were running a criminal enterprise. His investigation had uncovered financial records showing over $30,000 in fraudulent transactions, evidence of compromised teacher accounts that had been used to change grades, and a network of complicit students who had paid for better grades and then been recruited as participants in the harassment campaigns. The beauty of it, David said bitterly, was that anyone who tried to report them could be discredited as either a jealous academic rival or someone who was clearly below their level socially. They'd built the perfect system. But perfect systems have perfect vulnerabilities. On Thursday morning, while I was in AP Literature discussing the themes of justice in To Kill a Mockingbird, Detective Johnson arrived at Westbridge Preparatory Academy with a search warrant. The raid was swift and comprehensive. Officers seized computers, phones, and financial records from the administrative offices. They arrested Michael Stevens in the middle of his AP Physics class and Christopher Davis during lacrosse practice. Principal Morrison was escorted off campus in handcuffs, charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to violate federal civil rights laws. But the real shock came when they arrested Christopher's mother, Chief of Police Rebecca Davis, for conspiracy and abuse of her official position to interfere with criminal investigations. The network of corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined. Chief Davis had been actively suppressing police reports related to the harassment campaign. Judge Stevens had been using his influence to pressure prosecutors to drop charges against his son and his son's associates. School Board President William Davis, Christopher's father, had been manipulating school policies to protect the grade manipulation scheme. By Friday afternoon, the story had gone national. Connecticut prep school scandal, systematic cover-up of student harassment. Ring leads to federal investigation. Judge, police chief, school officials arrested in elaborate scheme to protect student criminals. Title IX, Violation or Criminal Enterprise, How One Student's Constitutional Law Knowledge Exposed Decades of Corruption. The cable news trucks lined the street outside Westbridge. Reporters interviewed students, parents, and legal experts about the implications of what they were calling the most comprehensive institutional cover-up in recent educational history. But for me, the most important moment came on Saturday morning, when I received a phone call from Lisa Chen, the first victim whose case Ms. Martinez had shown me. "Sarah," she said, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it, "I wanted to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," I said. "You were brave enough to report what happened to you 2 years ago. I just had the tools to help people listen." "No," she said. "You gave all of us something we'd never had before. You gave us proof that we weren't crazy, that what happened to us mattered, that we deserved justice." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," she said, "we make sure this never happens to anyone else." The legal proceedings took 8 months. Michael Stevens was sentenced to 18 months in juvenile detention and required to register as a sex offender. Christopher Davis pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for testimony against the adult conspirators and received probation with community service. Principal Morrison was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for violating federal civil rights laws. Judge Stevens was removed from the bench and disbarred. Chief Davis lost her job and was sentenced to community service, though she avoided prison time through her cooperation with federal investigators. But the real victory wasn't the individual sentences, it was the systemic change. The Department of Education's investigation resulted in a complete overhaul of Westbridge's administration and policies. The school was placed under federal monitoring and required to implement comprehensive anti-harassment training and transparent reporting procedures. More importantly, our case became the foundation for new Connecticut state legislation requiring mandatory reporting of privacy violations in educational settings and creating criminal penalties for institutional cover-ups of sexual harassment. 6 months after the arrests, I received a letter from Duke University offering me a full scholarship to their undergraduate program with guaranteed admission to their law school upon graduation. The letter mentioned that they were particularly impressed by my demonstrated commitment to civil rights and justice. But the letter that meant the most came from my grandmother's former law clerk, who'd heard about the case and wanted to share something my grandmother had told her years before she died. Patricia always said that the law was like a musical instrument, beautiful when played by someone who understood both its power and its responsibility. She would be proud to know that her granddaughter learned to play it so well. On graduation day, I sat in the same back row where I'd spent most of senior year. But everything was different. The 6 other girls who'd joined the Title IX complaint sat with their families, no longer isolated or ashamed. David Chen gave the valedictorian speech about courage and truth. Ms. Martinez, who had been promoted to Assistant Superintendent for Student Safety, smiled at me from the faculty section. During the ceremony, Principal Carmen Martinez, who'd replaced her uncle after his arrest, announced the establishment of the Student Legal Defense Network, funded by settlement money from the civil lawsuit we'd filed against the school district. This network, she said, will provide legal resources and advocacy training to students across Connecticut who face harassment, discrimination, or institutional indifference. It exists because one student refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos and celebrations, I walked to my car carrying my grandmother's constitutional law book. Inside the front cover, I'd added my own inscription below hers, "Knowledge is power, but only if you have the courage to use it. And sometimes, the courage to use it gives other people the courage to speak up." Sarah Thompson, Class of 2024. As I drove away from Westbridge for the last time, I thought about something Detective Johnson had told me during the investigation. He'd said that the most dangerous criminals weren't the ones who acted alone. They were the ones who convinced everyone around them that their behavior was normal, inevitable, just the way things were. But systems only seem inevitable until someone proves they're not. 3 years later, as a freshman at Duke, I received an email from a high school student in California who'd heard about the Student Legal Defense Network. She was facing harassment at her school, and administrators were telling her there was nothing they could do. Her email ended with a simple question: "Can you help me understand my rights?" I opened my laptop and began typing my response, remembering my grandmother's words and understanding, finally, what she'd really meant. Knowledge is power. Courage is what makes that power meaningful. And sometimes, when you stand up for yourself, you discover you're actually standing up for everyone who comes after you. 5 years after Westbridge, I graduated from Duke Law School magna cum laude. My father sat in the front row, wearing the same tie he'd worn to court the day he chose truth over security. Beside him sat an empty chair with my grandmother's constitutional law book resting on the seat, a reminder that some legacies transcend death. The Student Legal Defense Network had grown to serve students in 12 states, handling over 400 cases of institutional harassment and discrimination. We'd forced policy changes in 63 school districts and trained over 2,000 student advocates. But the moment that meant, everything came during my bar exam celebration. When I received a text from a 17-year-old girl in Oregon, "Because of your network, my school finally listened. Thank you for showing me that scholarship kids deserve justice too." I looked at that message and realized that my grandmother had been right about something else she'd told me. The law isn't about winning cases, Sarah. It's about making sure that power serves people, not the other way around. Sometimes justice takes time, but it's always worth the wait.